Thank you for attending this presentation for the I-75 Oakland Noise Study. This presentation will cover a study introduction, the noise modeling process and results, and next steps for the study. Please hold questions until the end for the Q&A. This evaluation has been completed in response to a citizen-led request to investigate noise levels and the potential for additional noise barriers that might benefit noise-impacted residents and property owners in the I-75 study area. It follows several previous studies for the I-75 modernization project focusing on segments 7 through 12 from the original 14 study area segments, which is roughly a 10-mile section from approximately 13-mile road to Adams Road, as shown on the figure, which also shows the noise measurement sites that were gathered on November 2nd and 3rd of last year. The measurements are not used to determine whether there are impacts or whether noise abatement is needed, but rather to validate use of the federally required traffic noise model called TNM through comparison of measured and modeled noise levels. Noise measurements were taken at 14 site locations, and these measurements were conducted with a Type 1 sound level meter for a period of 15 minutes each, with traffic recorded concurrently with video. The measured noise levels and traffic counts were input into TNM to validate the noise model. The model results are compared to the measured noise levels to determine if they are within plus or minus 3 decibels of each other, which satisfies the MDOT requirement for validating the noise model with measurements. To summarize the results, noise levels ranged from 56 A weighted decibels at a location in Firefighters Park, approximately 1,800 feet from I-75, to 73 A weighted decibels at a location north of Square Lake Road, approximately 200 feet from I-75. Next, we will cover the noise model process. FHWA's procedures for abatement of highway traffic noise and construction noise as presented in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 23, Part 772, as well as the MDOT Highway Noise Analysis and Abatement Handbook, govern the noise analysis procedures. Existing sound levels in the project area are modeled using the latest FHWA approved traffic noise model, which is TNM 2.5. Future sound levels are then also determined through use of TNM, using a future projected loudest hour traffic year in the model. The model contains specific inputs such as roadway configuration and elevations, shielding elements such as bridges or buildings, topography, and ground type in order to create a representation of the study area environment. Noise impact occurs for residential and outdoor recreational land use when predicted sound levels approach, which means within 1 decibel, or exceed the noise abatement criteria of 67 A weighted decibels, or if future sound levels exceed existing by 10 decibels or more. The noise abatement criteria for other noise-sensitive land uses are also given in this table from the federal regulation. After impacts are identified, we analyze noise abatement. For noise barrier abatement, a barrier is feasible if it has no construction impediments, meets safety requirements for the traveling public, and acoustically can provide at least 5 A weighted decibels of noise reduction at 75% of the impacted receptors. A barrier is reasonable if it provides a design year traffic noise reduction design goal of at least 10 A weighted decibels for one or more benefited receptors and at least 7 A weighted decibels for 50% or more of the benefited receptors. Benefited receptors are those that get 5 decibels or more of noise reduction. As part of reasonableness, a barrier must be cost effective. To be cost effective, a noise barrier's estimated preliminary construction cost must be no more than 3% above the allowable cost per benefited receptor unit of $52,248 in 2023 dollars. And this is assuming a planning cost of $45 per square foot of noise barrier. This graphic illustrates where noise barriers are typically most effective in mitigating highway noise. Sound intensity is inversely related to distance. The further a receiver is from the noise source, the less intense it sounds. Noise barriers do not eliminate roadway noise. Rather, they block the direct path of the sound and reduce the intensity. Effectiveness depends on the distance between the impacted receptor and the barrier. Benefit decreases as a listener moves farther away from the barrier and is negligent at distances greater than 300 to 500 feet, depending on additional study area elements. This is due to diffraction of noise over the top of the barrier, in conjunction with the fact that noise levels are already lower with increased distance, so noise barriers are most effective in the shadow zone identified in this graphic. Next, we'll discuss the noise modeling results for this study. The noise study area includes an 800-foot boundary around the study limits in order to capture additional receptors outside of the zone of impact that were not included in previous studies. Several additional receptors outside of 800 feet are also included in the study to provide TNM predicted noise levels for informational purposes. Please note, the findings in this study are not intended for comparison to results from the previous studies, as corridor conditions and MDOT noise abatement criteria have changed since then. "14 noise barriers have been evaluated in this study. 2 are existing noise barriers without predicted noise impact behind the barrier. Therefore, no further evaluation is completed for those. 6 are existing noise barriers with noise impact predicted behind the barrier. So per FHWA guidance, these were further evaluated against MDOT's feasibility and reasonableness criteria to determine if they are meeting the criteria as built. 6 potential noise barriers were evaluated in new locations to determine if MDOT's current feasibility and reasonableness criteria could be met based on the current highway configuration and latest roadway speed data. Of these 6, 4 barriers meet preliminary feasibility criteria. but do not meet the reasonableness criteria. Two barriers meet MDOT's preliminary feasibility and reasonableness criteria. Let's go through these results in more detail. These figures will show the 800-foot study area, the common noise environments, the measurement sites, receptor noise analysis and barrier analysis results, and the evaluated noise barriers. Starting at the south end of the study area, the first existing barrier, noise barrier 1, has little impact behind it. Note that these figures will show the receptor results with the existing barrier in place. Due to the one impact shown here on the north end, this barrier was evaluated to determine if it is feasible and reasonable as built based on current MDOT criteria. This is accomplished by comparing the no barrier scenario to the built barrier scenario in the future year noise model. This barrier is feasible and reasonable as built. Moving north, there are non-residential receptors west of I-75 that were evaluated due to outdoor use spaces as hotels, offices, or restaurants. Note that barriers were not analyzed for the few impacts found at these types of sites because they are isolated locations. Continuing north, we'll get to noise barrier 2 on the next slide. Some residential and recreational areas behind noise barrier 2 are at 66 decibels or above, resulting in impact. This barrier was also evaluated against current MDOT criteria and found to be feasible and reasonable. The same situation exists for noise barrier 3 and noise barrier 4. Noise barrier 4 was found to be feasible and reasonable as built. However, noise barrier 3 was not quite meeting the noise reduction requirements of 10 decibels at one receptor or 7 decibels at 50% of benefited receptors. Although it is still very cost effective. Because the analysis for this existing barrier with the current highway configuration and latest roadway speed data is shown for informational purposes and there is no project being analyzed. No further analysis or recommendations are intended for this barrier. Here are the west ends of noise barrier 3 and noise barrier 4. Next, noise barrier 5 was evaluated as a new barrier for impacted residents south of Big Beaver Road. However, due to the low number of receptors, this barrier is not reasonable. Moving north of Big Beaver Road, we have noise barrier 6 on the east side and noise barrier 7 on the west side. Noise barrier 6 is a new evaluated barrier for impacted residents. Note that these receptor results will show both the noise level results without a barrier as well as the benefit information with the analyzed barrier. Noise barrier 6 is not reasonable due to two factors. One, the attenuation requirement of 7 decibels for 50% or more of benefited receptors is not achieved. And 2, it is not cost effective. One of the challenges at this location are the existing berms in the area, which make it difficult to get the necessary noise reduction at receptors for reasonableness. Noise barrier 8 and noise barrier 9 are existing barriers north of Waddles Road, where no impact is predicted, so no additional analysis was completed. Note that these barriers were built with absorptive surface on the roadway side. Noise barrier 10 is a new barrier analyzed north of noise barrier 8 for the impacts identified in the Hedgewood Drive area. Noise barrier 10 was found to be feasible and reasonable based on current MDOT criteria. The estimated planning cost of this barrier is $2,434,185. Moving north around Long Lake Road, no impact is predicted as receptors get farther from the roadway. This figure also shows lines indicating the distance to the 71 and 66 decibel noise level in the open spaces between the roadway and receivers. South of Long Lake, a berm near the neighborhood reduces the distance to 66 decibels, while north of Long Lake, an existing building is providing shielding as well. Continuing north, we have some non-impacted office, hotel, and restaurant outdoor locations. Continuing past Crooks Road, we have noise barrier 11 on the north side and noise barrier 12 on the south side. Noise barrier 12 has little impact behind it and was found to be feasible and reasonable as built. Noise barrier 11 is a new barrier analyzed for the residences north of I-75 and Firefighters Park. This barrier was found to be feasible and reasonable based on current MDOT criteria. Note that the dwelling unit equivalents calculated for Firefighters Park are based on the area of the park experiencing impact and receiving varying levels of noise reduction from the analyzed barriers. These areas were determined using a dense grid of receptors in T and M to gather results, and these areas are divided by an average residential lot size in the nearby neighborhoods to determine units. The estimated planning cost of this barrier is $3,760,920. Continuing west of Coolidge Highway, noise barrier 13 and noise barrier 14 are new barriers analyzed on either side of I-75 for the predicted impacts. For noise barrier 13, the only criteria not met is the cost reasonableness threshold, which it is well over at $155,954 per benefited receptor. Noise barrier 14, again, is not reasonable due to two factors. One, the attenuation requirement of 7 decibels for 50% or more of benefited receptors is not achieved. And two, it is not cost effective. The terrain on the south side of I-75 makes it challenging to gain sufficient noise reduction on this side. The cost per benefited receptor is again high at $113,277. Note that for both noise barrier 13 and noise barrier 14, the analyzed barrier includes segments of bridges at a 20-foot height. These segments were included in the analysis to confirm whether or not a feasible and reasonable barrier could be achieved with additional shielding from barriers on bridges. However, a design nearer to the allowable cost per benefited unit could not be achieved. Also note, Shorter lengths of these barriers were evaluated, but were also not reasonable nor cost effective. And here is our last slide with the results showing the far west ends of noise barrier 13 and 14. As far as next steps, abatement measures are dependent on the outcome of a final design process, as well as funding availability. Noise analysis in final design is necessary to determine actual cost and identify potential constructability or safety issues. For reference, presented here is a range of anticipated cost estimates for the feasible and reasonable barriers based on more accurate and recent cost data. Note that these ranges are general estimates, and actual cost will depend on site-specific variables and the materials being used for construction. Here, the project schedule shows where we are in April with the draft noise report and this public meeting. The next steps will be to gather public comments and finalize the noise report by end of May 2023. With that, thank you again for listening to this presentation, and I'll open it up for Q&A.